Welcome to Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton Short, Professor of Geography at the George Washington University and Chief Reader of Advanced Placement Human Geography. Join us as Dr. Short interviews Dr. Parag Khanna, geostrategist, world traveler, and best-selling author, discussing central concepts in the AP Human Geography curriculum through the lens of his new book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. This discussion series is brought to you by the American Geographical Society, the foremost champion of geography for the benefit of society since 1851. And now, over to Dr. Lisa Benton Short.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back, geographers. This is Lisa Benton Short. I'm having a great conversation with Parag Khanna, and our conversation today is going to focus on Unit 5, Agricultural and Rural Land Use Patterns and Processes. And I love this unit because it reminds us that all humans are dependent on one of the most important natural resources, food and water. And this is a really two-directional relationship, right? Because on the one hand, humans have modified the environment by practicing agriculture, so changing land use. But we also remain incredibly dependent on a quality environment for sustaining our lives. So Parag, I'm going to do something unusual. I'm going to start with a map that I want to talk about and then get your take on this. So this is a map that is showing you the optimal areas for growing food around the world. And by optimal, what I'm really showing on this map is those places where climate and precipitation and good soils and just the right temperature environment for growing some of our major crops like corn or wheat or rice. These areas shown in green are those areas on the planet where we can grow a lot of food. And as a geographer, the other thing I know is there are a lot of countries on this map where there are no green. And this begs the question, what is going on with food production and how do we understand hunger, food insecurity in a planet of 7.8 billion? And what does that portend to the future?
Phenomenal. And this map just is worth well more than 1,000 words, Lisa, because it so illustrates one of the puzzles of human geography and the question that we began with, which is the alignment of our natural and political and human and functional geography. Because as you said, we can't survive without food. The food isn't grown where the people are. And it gets even more complicated because of climate change, because the geography of optimal food production is shifting. Now, today, I'll move to the next map. Today, and I think students might know this, the largest food producing countries in the world are the United States, Brazil, India, China, and Australia. But if temperatures continue to rise, one scientific journal predicts that this will be the map of geographies of potential food production. And as with your previous map, the color scheme is very revealing, right? Where is the green? But again, Lisa, let's think about the alignment of geographies. How many people today live in the country, in the space that is green on this map? Imagine temperatures continue to rise 2 or 3 degrees, Celsius. Not many, right? A tiny, tiny fraction of the world population lives in those geographies. So the misalignment is actually getting worse. And, Canada and Russia are, in fact, becoming among the world's largest food producers. In some areas, they already are, like wheat and so forth. Now, the question is, something like this doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual phenomenon. We are seeing the shifts happening year by year, where some places are experiencing drought, and in the same year, other countries are experiencing their record harvests. So the question becomes, can we still have a global food system that is going to be able to produce and distribute food to people around the world? Or what can we do also to become less dependent on far-flung global supply chains for agriculture that are themselves one of the main drivers of climate change, because the agricultural industry represents something like 15% of global emissions. So in the process of feeding ourselves, we are accelerating the climate change that is making it a lot more complicated to feed ourselves. And so I bring up not a map, but a set of models, or sort of pictograms that are kind of showing us what different ways of conceiving about our food, water, and energy systems have looked like and could look like. In simpler times, in ancient times, we'd say all the way through the Middle Ages, really, and through the Industrial Revolution era, so up until relatively recently, we lived in the so-called agropolis world, right? Food was produced relatively near where it was consumed. And in the 20th century, with rapid globalization and a hydrocarbon-based economy, the cost of transporting anything and everything around the world through railways, shipping lines, and of course airplanes came rapidly down. And we raised production and output through genetically modified crops and other technologies everywhere, so that now you can have an avocado or a watermelon or any other food item from anywhere in the world delivered anywhere else in the world in a short period of time. But that's what's accelerated the climate change. So the question becomes, can we get back to this? Can we get to this image on the right? Can we use renewable resources and be more efficient and conserve water and go back to sustainable farming practices to generate a more so-called circular economy where we produce more food locally despite the risks posed by climate change? And here you bring in the technology factor as well, because even if we were to live under that tragic scenario from the last map, right, in which natural organic food production becomes very difficult other than in remote northern latitudes in certain periods of time, because of course the northern hemisphere has a pretty harsh winter, right? Can we use the vertical farms and the hydroponic and aquaponic agriculture and even plant-based and cell-based protein to produce food as well? So we're in a very interesting time around the geography of food production, because it's no longer just the geo, it's really technology also. And that's going to be a critical part of answering the question around how many people are going to survive and where they're going to live. And so that's another reason why this is such an exciting time to be studying human geography, right, Lisa?
Absolutely. And I think, the challenge is that many experts say we currently grow enough food to feed all 7.8 billion of us on this planet, but it is more an issue of distribution and some of the other issues around food insecurity, such as poverty, that get at why we still have almost 800 million people hungry every year. So I want to talk a little bit about, how do we get to ecopolis? Especially for a lot of the food insecure countries or regions like sub-Saharan Africa. I know that there's been, in the last 7 to 10 years, development called the New Green Revolution for Africa. I want to ask you, what do you think that entails, and could it help really reduce the amount of people who are food insecure as a solution?
We hope that it could. And the original Green Revolution, for those who don't know, it's attributed to the changes in farming practices and seed technology that allowed a country like India, who was very poor, to radically increase its agricultural output. As I mentioned before, it has become one of the world's largest food producers, as its own population was growing so rapidly in the mid 20th century. So the new Green Revolution has to be something global, because our population globally has become so large. Africa itself has over 1 billion people. And one of the things that is a positive development in Africa is a growing focus on agricultural productivity and not building on arable land, but rather conserving that land and engaging in the kind of restorative practices and using some of those latest agricultural technologies, and being efficient with water resources and doing more high-tech irrigation and using the latest seed technologies to really boost Africa's food production for itself and for export. And I think that is, those practices are spreading from the countries that excel in plant genetics and seed technologies as far flung as the Netherlands, Brazil, Japan. We're seeing the science really developing and helping to spread these technologies into Africa and elsewhere, so that we could have more food production, even in harsh ecological or climatic conditions. So I would ask you, Lisa, do you think it's going to work?
Well, I really want to believe that it will work, because most of the world's food insecure are located in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and so whatever we can do to target investment in increasing agricultural productivity. Now, the new Green Revolution approaches things a little different than the previous Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. There is a focus on more sustainability within agriculture. So they're trying to increase renewable energy. They're trying to make sure that women, who are the biggest number of farm workers in some of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, have access to credit, microcredit, land tenure. So there's some really interesting ways that the Green Revolution in Africa is trying to maybe avoid some of the pitfalls of the original Green Revolution. And I'm just wondering, some of these new technologies as well. I'm wondering, do you think things like hydro or aquaponics or even vertical farming, are these solutions in Africa, or are they solutions elsewhere? Should more be being done to embrace some of these technologies, especially outside of some of those optimal food growing areas?
Right now, we're seeing those technologies spread either in very dense environments, like in Japan, so wealthy countries that are densely populated, that have that are invested in agricultural technology. So there, we're seeing a real takeoff in hydro and aquaponics and vertical farming. Australia is doing it too. So you also get into the climate stressed rich countries where this is happening. So some of the countries that are investing the most in bringing in hydro and aquaponics are indeed places like Australia, which is having more frequent droughts, and even desert countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are bringing those companies and technologies in. They're even starting to do underground hydro and aquaponic food bunkers that are producing vegetables. And they're doing this now also in a place like Iceland, using geothermal power, which is abundant in Iceland. So using geothermal power to have greenhouses year round, summer or winter, not that they have a long winter in Iceland, but year round they can. So you're starting to see Nordic and Arctic countries that, because of these technologies, are able to become more self-sufficient, at least in vegetables. And now with cell-based meat and plant-based meat, this broader family in a way of technologies, again, we could see as the cost comes down, we could see that spread. And it really comes down to how much momentum, because, as the world gets wealthier, people all over the world have a higher caloric consumption, more food intake, want more diversity of their food. So these technologies will need to be everywhere, because individuals everywhere are making more complex or have more complex demand for food. What are your thoughts about, what will individuals do? What is our role, each and every one of us?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's really appropriate for us to step back and remember scale in this phenomena, right? So we've been talking about agriculture kind of at the big scale of international efforts to boost food production, or a country's efforts to, utilize geothermal power and set up greenhouses in Iceland. Let's talk a little bit about all the way down to the individual consumer, because I think sometimes we don't appreciate the power that individual consumers have to influence the global food system. So let's talk about this. This is an infographic about how much water is in your hamburger. And I realize this says liters of water, so I will translate for everybody. So on average, your hamburger uses about 830 gallons of water. And that's kind of what we refer to as hidden water or virtual water, the water that goes into the production of things before they reach you. And so, for example, it takes water to grow the wheat that becomes your bun bread. It takes water to feed pigs, and that ends up being your bacon. It takes water to grow tomatoes and lettuce. And remarkably, it takes almost 660 gallons of water to get one beef patty. So that's the hidden water that goes into, not only giving fresh water to cows, but the fact that we feed cows grains, and we have to water those or irrigate those agricultural fields for grain production, and then transportation. So there's quite a lot of water in your burger. And if you're concerned about sustainable agricultural processes, a hamburger is probably one of the least sustainable food items that you can consume. And so it does kind of beg the question of, we do have some individual agency or ability to make choices as consumers about what we choose to buy and consume for food. So what are your thoughts about this, Parag?
Well, I think right now, going back to linking this to, youth culture, and one of those values was sustainability, which has really become, in a way, the equivalent, and I think a very valid equivalent, of a religion almost in that global youth culture. And that could be one of the saving factors for our future, is that the young generation is conscious of this. Whether or not they become vegetarian is not necessarily the question, though, of course, as you have demonstrated here, it would have an impact. But the consciousness around water consumption, not just in the burger, but water consumption also in the retail and apparel industry, right? The water that's necessary to prepare the dyes that color our clothes, and these kinds of things. So there is indeed a water, index, if you will, that we need to be mindful of, because it is, of course, the most fundamental element for our survival. So I think that infographics like this, are a huge part of that educational role and raising that consciousness so that we can make smarter choices.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's really important to see the interconnections again of these units, and the interconnections to some of the cross-cutting themes in AP Human Geography. Sustainability is one, globalization is another. The role of women is so pronounced in agriculture around the world. And then also just that notion of climate change and how that could impact so much of what we grow and where we grow it, that is a really timely issue for us to be talking about in AP Human Geography, because it does literally, possibly change the map of the world. So thank you so much for joining us in our discussion about agricultural and rural land use. And we'll see you in our next unit that looks at cities and urban land use.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton Short. Tune in for this and more great geography teaching resources at americangeo.org. Until next time.